Inflation is often described in numbers: 3% this year, 7% last year, 2% target. It is discussed in charts, debated by economists, and announced in official reports. But for ordinary people, inflation does not feel like a statistic. It feels like something quieter and more personal. It feels like standing in a grocery store aisle, staring at a price tag you're sure was lower just months ago. It feels like rent rising faster than your paycheck. It feels like your savings account slowly losing its power, even though the number printed on the screen hasn't changed. Inflation is often called a natural part of a growing economy. Yet for millions, it operates like a silent theft, subtle, gradual, and deeply transformative. At its core, inflation is the increase in the general price level of goods and services over time. When inflation occurs, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services than before. A dollar today does not stretch as far as it did a year ago. That's the technical definition. But the lived experience is different. Imagine earning the same salary for 3 years in a row, while the cost of food, transportation, healthcare, and housing steadily climbs. You are not being robbed in the traditional sense. No one has taken money from your wallet, yet your ability to live comfortably, to save, to plan, is quietly eroding. That erosion is inflation. The silent nature of inflation is what makes it so powerful. Unlike taxes, which are debated and voted on, inflation often happens in the background. Governments do not usually announce, "Your purchasing power will decline this year." Instead, it shows up in increments: a small price increase here, a reduced package size there. A cereal box that once held 500 grams now contains 450 grams, but the price remains the same. This phenomenon, often called shrinkflation, masks the true impact. Consumers might not immediately notice that they are paying more for less. Over time, however, these small adjustments compound into a significant shift in living standards. One of the primary drivers of inflation is the expansion of the money supply. When more money circulates in the economy without a corresponding increase in goods and services, the value of each unit of money tends to fall. Think of it as that if you pour more water into a glass of juice without adding more juice concentrate, the flavor weakens. Similarly, when currency is created faster than economic output grows, the purchasing power of that currency can weaken. Central banks often expand the money supply during economic downturns to stimulate spending and prevent collapse. While such policies can stabilize economies in the short term, they can also contribute to rising prices over time. Inflation does not affect everyone equally. In fact, its impact can be deeply unequal. Those who own assets, real estate, stocks, commodities often see their wealth rise during inflationary periods because asset prices tend to increase alongside or ahead of consumer prices. Meanwhile, those who rely primarily on wages may find themselves struggling to keep up. If wages grow slower than inflation, real income declines. A 3% raise may sound positive, but if inflation is 5%, that raise effectively becomes a 2% pay cut in terms of purchasing power. The middle class often feels the squeeze most intensely. Wealthy individuals typically have diversified investments that can hedge against inflation. Lower-income households may receive certain forms of government assistance that adjusts with price levels, but middle-income earners, who rely heavily on fixed salaries and modest savings, often find themselves caught in the middle. Their expenses, rise in mortgages, insurance premiums, tuition fees, yet their financial buffers are limited. Over time, inflation can push families who once felt secure into a constant state of financial anxiety. Housing is one of the clearest examples of inflation's silent grip. In many regions, housing costs have outpaced wage growth for years. Renters may face annual increases that steadily consume a larger share of their income. Prospective homeowners encounter rising property prices that require larger down payments and bigger mortgages. Even existing homeowners are not immune. Property taxes and maintenance costs often climb alongside home values. As housing becomes more expensive, it reshapes life decisions. Delaying marriage, postponing children, relocating farther from city centers, or abandoning homeownership dreams altogether. Food prices provide another daily reminder. Agricultural disruptions, supply chain challenges, energy costs, and monetary policy all intersect to influence the price of groceries. When staple items like bread, milk, rice, and vegetables rise in cost, households must adjust. They may switch brands, buy in bulk, or reduce portion sizes. For many families, especially those living paycheck to paycheck, even modest increases in grocery bills can force difficult trade-offs between nutrition and other necessities. Energy inflation has a ripple effect throughout the economy. Higher fuel prices increase transportation costs, which in turn raise the price of goods delivered to stores. Heating and electricity bills rise, squeezing household budgets further. Businesses facing higher operating costs may pass those expenses on to consumers, creating a feedback loop. In this way, inflation is not isolated to a single category. It spreads, touching nearly every aspect of daily life. Savings accounts illustrate another dimension of silent theft. When inflation outpaces the interest earned on savings, the real value of saved money declines. Suppose you have $10,000 in a savings account earning 1% interest, but inflation is running at 4%. In nominal terms, your balance grows slightly. In real terms, your purchasing power shrinks. Over several years, this erosion becomes significant. Money that once represented a safety net for emergencies or future plans gradually loses its strength. Without careful investment strategies, savers may find that time works against them. Retirees are particularly vulnerable. Many retirees rely on fixed incomes from pensions or savings accumulated over decades. If those income streams do not adjust adequately for inflation, their standard of living can decline year after year. Medical expenses, which often rise faster than general inflation, compound the problem. A retirement plan built on assumptions of stable prices can unravel in the face of persistent inflation. Inflation also influences debt dynamics. Interestingly, borrowers can sometimes benefit from inflation. When prices and wages rise, the real value of fixed-rate debt falls. A mortgage taken out years ago may feel lighter if income has increased, while monthly payments remain constant. However, this benefit is not universal. New borrowers may face higher interest rates as lenders seek to compensate for expected inflation. Credit card rates, auto loans, and business financing can become more expensive, limiting access to credit and slowing economic activity. The psychology of inflation plays a critical role in its persistence. Expectations matter. If consumers expect prices to rise, they may accelerate purchases, increasing demand and pushing prices up further. If workers expect higher living costs, they demand higher wages. Businesses anticipating higher input costs may preemptively raise prices. These self-fulfilling dynamics can entrench inflation. Once the belief that everything is getting more expensive becomes widespread, reversing that mindset can require significant policy intervention. Central banks attempt to manage inflation primarily through interest rates. By raising rates, they aim to reduce borrowing and spending, cooling demand and slowing price growth. However, higher interest rates come with trade-offs. They can dampen investment, increase unemployment, and slow economic growth. The delicate balance between controlling inflation and sustaining employment is one of the most challenging tasks in economic policy. Tightening too aggressively risks recession. Tightening too slowly risks entrenched inflation. While moderate inflation is often considered normal in modern economies, high or unpredictable inflation can destabilize societies. History offers numerous examples of hyperinflation, where prices spiral out of control and currency loses nearly all value. In such extreme cases, savings are wiped out, contracts become meaningless, and barter systems may re-emerge. Although most developed economies avoid such extremes, the fear of losing control remains a powerful motivator for policymakers. Globalization has historically acted as a counterbalance to inflation. By enabling companies to source cheaper labor and materials from around the world, it has kept production costs lower. However, shifts toward deglobalization, trade tensions, and supply chain disruptions can reduce these deflationary pressures. When countries prioritize domestic production or face geopolitical constraints, costs may rise. Consumers ultimately bear much of that burden. Technology also interacts with inflation in complex ways. Innovations can reduce production costs and improve efficiency, lowering prices in certain sectors. For example, consumer electronics have often become more powerful and affordable over time. Yet technology can also create new categories of spending, services that did not exist decades ago: streaming subscriptions, cloud storage, AP-based services, now occupy a portion of household budgets. The cumulative effect is not always straightforwardly deflationary. One subtle aspect of inflation is how it alters time horizons. When prices are stable, long-term planning feels rational and predictable. Individuals can save for a house, education, or retirement with some confidence about future costs. When inflation is volatile, uncertainty increases. People may prioritize short-term consumption over long-term saving, fearing that their money will lose value. Businesses may hesitate to invest in long-term projects. This shift in behavior can slow economic progress and reduce overall prosperity. Inflation can also strain social trust. When the cost of living rises faster than incomes, frustration grows. Citizens may question the competence of leaders, the fairness of the economic system, or the integrity of institutions. Political polarization can intensify as different groups blame each other for rising prices. Inflation is not merely an economic phenomenon. It is a social and political force. The phrase silent theft captures the emotional dimension of inflation. Theft implies loss without consent. While inflation is not a criminal act, its effects can feel involuntary and unfair. People who have worked diligently, saved responsibly, and planned carefully may find their efforts undermined by forces beyond their control. The erosion is gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but over years and decades, it reshapes wealth, distribution, and life opportunities. Compounding is central to understanding inflation's long-term impact. A 2% annual inflation rate may seem negligible, but over 20 years, prices rise by nearly 50%. Over 35 years, they more than double. This means that a lifestyle requiring $50,000 per year today may require over $100,000 in a few decades just to maintain the same standard of living. Without income growth that keeps pace, living standards decline. Education costs illustrate compounding vividly. Tuition fees in many regions have risen faster than general inflation for decades. Families planning for their children's future must save significantly more than previous generations did. Student debt burdens grow, influencing career choices and delaying milestones such as homeownership. What once seemed achievable with moderate savings now requires substantial financial resources. Healthcare inflation presents similar challenges. Advances in medical technology improve outcomes, but often at higher costs. Insurance premiums, prescription prices, and hospital bills can rise steadily, straining both households and public budgets. For individuals facing chronic conditions, inflation in healthcare is not an abstract concept. It directly affects quality of life and financial security. Inflation also interacts with inequality in subtle ways. Asset owners may benefit from rising prices, while wage earners lag behind. Over time, wealth concentrates further among those positioned to leverage inflationary environments. This divergence can widen the gap between the rich and the rest, altering social mobility and economic fairness. Currency depreciation on the international stage adds another layer. If a country experiences higher inflation than its trading partners, its currency may weaken. Imports become more expensive, further fueling domestic price increases. Travelers find their money goes less far abroad. International investors may demand higher returns to compensate for currency risk. Thus, domestic inflation can have global repercussions. For businesses, inflation complicates planning and pricing strategies. Companies must decide how much of rising costs to absorb and how much to pass on to consumers. Raise prices too aggressively, and customers may leave. Absorb too much, and profit margins shrink. Small businesses often have less flexibility than large corporations, making them particularly vulnerable. The labor market reflects inflationary pressures as well. Workers demand higher wages to keep up with living costs. Employers facing higher payroll expenses may automate processes or reduce hiring. In some cases, a wage price spiral can develop, where rising wages and rising prices reinforce each other. Breaking such a cycle can require painful adjustments. Despite its challenges, inflation is not inherently evil. A modest, predictable rate can encourage spending and investment, reducing the incentive to hoard cash. It can facilitate adjustments in relative prices and wages. The problem arises when inflation accelerates beyond expectations or persists at levels that erode stability. Personal strategies to cope with inflation often involve diversification and long-term thinking. Investing in assets that historically outpace inflation, such as equities or real estate, can help preserve purchasing power. Developing skills that increase earning potential provides resilience. Reducing high-interest debt can mitigate vulnerability to rising rates. Yet not everyone has equal access to these strategies. Income constraints, financial literacy gaps, and systemic barriers limit options for many households. Ultimately, inflation's most profound effect may be psychological. It changes how people perceive value, security, and fairness. It shapes conversations at dinner tables and in boardrooms. It influences elections and policy debates. It quietly redraws the map of opportunity. When viewed over decades, inflation reveals itself not as a sudden shock, but as a slow transformation. The cost of living in most countries today is dramatically higher than it was a generation ago. Incomes have risen too, but not always evenly or proportionally. Some have surged ahead. Others have stagnated. The silent theft is not that prices rise, but that the benefits and burdens of that rise are unevenly distributed. In the end, inflation is a reminder that money is not static. Its value depends on trust, policy, productivity, and collective expectations. When managed carefully, it can coexist with growth and stability. When neglected or misunderstood, it can undermine prosperity and widen divides. The silence of inflation makes it easy to ignore in the short term, but over time its whisper becomes a force that reshapes economies and lives. To understand inflation is to recognize that the numbers reported in headlines translate into real consequences for real people. It is to see beyond percentages and into purchasing power, beyond policy statements and into household budgets. Inflation may not break down doors or empty bank accounts overnight. Instead, it works gradually, year after year, adjusting the terms of economic reality. And in that gradual adjustment lies its quiet power, the power of a silent theft that few notice at first, but many feel in the end.